Welcome, everyone. My name is Tom Solomon. I am co-coordinator with the environmental climate group called 350 New Mexico. It's the New Mexico chapter of 350.org. And what I'll be presenting today is a briefing that I've done for quite a number of groups, including a lot of legislators in New Mexico, on blue hydrogen. And it's all about the effort to basically produce hydrogen from natural gas / methane and the potential harms that will do. So that's the subject of today's call. And I'm going to put everybody on mute so that, and if you would keep yourselves on mute, that'd be great. So let me find my slide deck and get us into this. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Is that visible to people? Very good. All right, here we go. So it's called Blue Hydrogen Briefing, and I am Tom Solomon. And that little picture of the Hindenburg blowing up in 1937 gives you a hint about what's to come. Hydrogen is a potentially dangerous gas, needs to be treated with with significant care. And in most cases where they're proposing to use hydrogen, just using clean electricity instead is a much better answer. The key messages for this briefing are as follows, and there is a pretty good fact sheet from earlier in the year at this link, and I will put a link to these slides in the chat so that you can see them in the future. So blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen made from methane, is a fossil fuel program, and subsidies for that are actually fossil fuel subsidies. The carbon footprint, meaning the carbon emissions into the atmosphere from making blue hydrogen, is significantly more than 20% worse than just burning fossil natural gas directly for heat, according to two very credible peer-reviewed scientific studies. As an energy carrier, hydrogen is actually quite wasteful compared to just using electricity. It's at least 2.3 times worse in efficiency as electricity. And electricity from hydrogen is actually quite costly to make relative to the very cheap solar and wind that we have available now. So much so that it's actually unprofitable to make electricity from hydrogen. And what we should be doing and focusing on if we want to save the climate for ourselves and our children and the next generations is to focus urgently on rapidly building out wind and solar electricity production to replace the coal and gas-fired power plants that are causing so much climate pollution, and replace fossil fuel emissions, not to push hydrogen. There were 4 hydrogen hub bills in this last legislative session that failed due to a lot of community pushback, and they would have supported significantly increased carbon dioxide emissions. They defined a term called clean hydrogen, which is not clean because it would have allowed as much as 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide to be produced per kilogram of hydrogen. So that is not clean at all. It continues to produce carbon pollution. So why is all this hype going on about hydrogen? It seems to be all the rage, but if you look within the environmental community, it's not being pushed by environmentalists who understand and really care about preserving a livable climate. And there's a very good report published some months back by Earth Justice that is just one example of the pushbacks that we're seeing from the environmental community. So where it's coming from is actually from the oil and gas and pipeline companies. It started on or about 2017 with the formation in the European Union of something called the Hydrogen Council. And if you go on their website, you can conveniently see their logo sheet, which I've copied down here. And if you circle, which I did, the logos of the oil and gas companies, you see all of these various examples from British Petroleum to Shell to Chevron, Saudi Aramco and Baker Hughes and Southern California Gas, and companies, oil companies from China and Saudi Arabia, et cetera. And so it is really a program of the oil and gas industry to provide a path to sell more natural gas, which is their product, and to delay the clean energy transition, which will reduce the sales of their products and their profits, which they don't like at all. And behind a lot of this marketing hype, which it largely is a company called FTI Consulting, which is an oil and gas industry PR firm. So a lot of this hype to push hydrogen as a quote unquote solution to the energy crisis and the climate crisis is from FTI Consulting and oil and gas. Let's just start with the basics here. So what is hydrogen? It is actually the smallest atom in the universe. That's the periodic table, and here it is in the upper left corner. It contains one proton, so it is tiny, and it doesn't actually occur much in nature by itself. Molecular hydrogen, or H2, is highly reactive, so you find it in combination with hydrogen in the form of H2 or water, or in combination with various kinds of carbon in various hydrocarbons such as methane, which is CH4, or butane or propane, or all of the other hydrocarbons, but in this example, mostly methane. And so it takes a lot of energy to pry off either the oxygen or the carbon from those complicated molecules to create pure molecular hydrogen, or H2. So that's why we say hydrogen is an energy carrier, not really a fuel, because you have to invest a lot of energy up front just to create it, and then you have to transport it somewhere like any other fuel to do some useful work down the line. Where is hydrogen used today? Well, the vast majority of it is used in producing ammonia, mostly for fertilizer. 55% is that. Another 25% is in various forms of petroleum refining. There's another 10% slice which goes into methanol production, and another miscellaneous 10% other, which goes into other various forms. So it is mostly ammonia production and petroleum refining. And it is almost all made from fossil fuels today. About 98% of worldwide production of hydrogen comes from fossil fuels, mostly methane. And this is a chart that some groups have put out to kind of explain how you start with, some source and then turn it into hydrogen. And I am going to just talk about 3 of these versions of it. This is all hydrogen, but they've turned them in, they call them different colors just to denote how it was made. And the cleanest form of hydrogen is what's called green hydrogen. It releases hardly any carbon dioxide, because if you produce it from, 100% clean renewable energy, or maybe nuclear power, which doesn't emit much carbon, at least at the point of production, and you pass that electricity through water in a process called electrolysis, it bubbles off hydrogen and oxygen, and you capture the hydrogen, and that's, the purest form. They call that green hydrogen. But 98% of all the hydrogen that's actually produced is really from methane or natural gas, same thing. And you take, this form of methane, which is CH4, you run it through a very high temperature, high pressure industrial process called steam methane reforming. And that's one of these steam methane reformers. That's what that looks like. And it produces largely 2 things. It produces a lot of carbon dioxide, and then it produces some hydrogen. And in this way, they call it gray hydrogen. And like 98% of all hydrogen that's produced in the world today is this form of gray hydrogen. Remember, it's creating lots and lots of carbon dioxide at a ratio of about 9:1, actually. If, however, you make an attempt to capture some of that carbon dioxide in a process called carbon capture and storage, then and you sequester it, underground somewhere, you're capturing some, but not all. But to the extent that they do that, they call that blue hydrogen. So it still comes from methane and still does steam methane reforming, but you do some carbon capture and you try to store some of that underground. That's the blue hydrogen. And that's really what we're going to be talking about in the rest of the presentation. The attempt to convince us all that this blue hydrogen is somehow okay for the environment. And just some stats: in 2019, over 98% of worldwide demand for hydrogen, which is about 76.5 million metric tons, was sourced from fossil fuels or methane. Only about 0.2 million metric tons, or 0.25%, was this green hydrogen. So it is a tiny, tiny bit. And so don't let them greenwash the production of actual hydrogen, which is the vast majority is gray. There is a tiny amount of blue hydrogen being produced, not much at all. So it also turns out that fully 2%, 2.3% of all the global carbon dioxide emissions in the world come from producing hydrogen today. So this CO2 emitted from the steam methane reforming step is a big contributor to global warming. This slide is all about how hydrogen wastes energy. And this is an example in the transportation sector, and a group in Europe called Transport and Environment put this chart together. And they basically talk about, how efficient is it to get work out of what you're trying to accomplish, which is, in this case, moving a car or a truck, with various forms. And they looked at direct electrification, hydrogen, diesel fuels, power to liquid for petroleum. We're just going to talk about these first two, because that's really the comparison, which is using hydrogen in like a hydrogen fuel cell car or truck, or using just direct electricity in a battery electric vehicle or truck. And so let's talk about first, if you're using, let's say ideally you had 100% renewable electricity, the ideal case, solar or wind, and you take that electricity and you want to use it to power a car. Well, you have to transport the electricity to the car, say over some wires. In the transmission grid, you'll lose about 6% in heat losses there, so that's about 94% efficient. And then within the car, you've got to have the charging equipment and the battery storage. You got to convert direct current to alternating current and then run the motor. Each of those is about 5% losses. And if you multiply all of these losses together, of the 100% renewable electricity you started with, you've got about 70% left to do, power the vehicle, the power to wheels. And that is actually pretty darn good in the world of energy accounting. If you're trying to do that same thing and you start with, but in the case of hydrogen, you start with 100% renewable electricity and you're doing, the green hydrogen version of this, which would be taking that electricity, run it through water in the process of electrolysis, bubble off the hydrogen, capture it, and then transport and store it and distribute it. You're already about 68% efficiency, because electrolysis is only 76% efficient, 89% efficient to store and transport hydrogen. And then you've got the fuel cell. So within a fuel cell vehicle run by hydrogen, you take a fuel cell, which starts with hydrogen, runs it through the fuel cell, creates electricity, and then that is then used to go into the remaining portions of the electric vehicle run by a fuel cell, converting it from AC to DC, and then running the motor. All of these losses together, multiplying, end up meaning you've only used 33% of the renewable electricity you started with in the case of a hydrogen car to power the wheels. And so that is terrible compared to just direct electrification. The ratio of 77 to 33 is 2.3. So that's why we say, as an energy carrier, hydrogen is quite wasteful, 2.3 times worse than just using electricity for an electric vehicle. And this example, the losses that you see in electrolysis and in the fuel cell carry over to many, many applications of trying to use hydrogen to power various parts of the economy. You end up with all of these losses, and it's very inefficient. And if you just use electricity, you're much better off. The hydrogen Swiss Army knife is a way to kind of explain how various portions of this hydrogen marketing hype is trying to convince us that hydrogen's a good idea in many applications, and they propose using it in many sectors. So these things in the red box, that's where hydrogen is used today, right? Remember, we said it was used in fertilizer manufacturing for ammonia, and in a petrochemical refining. That's what these things are. But they're proposing also to use hydrogen for aviation and shipping, for ferries, for regional and long distance trucking, for urban delivery, trains and buses, domestic heating, industrial heat, electricity generation, all sorts of stuff. And in fact, theoretically, all of those things are possible, but they're not economically feasible because they got to compete with something better, which is direct electricity. So just like you would never use a Swiss Army knife to build your house, you would use, electric power tools. You're not going to use hydrogen for a lot of these things. And an attempt was made to try to order and put these things in some kind of a ladder that shows you the most efficient and economically beneficial competitive applications for those things. And they put them in this clean hydrogen ladder, give them a grade from A through G. And the top row of this ladder is where hydrogen is used today. And we said fertilizer, petrochemical refining, methanol production, all of that stuff. That's where hydrogen is used today. And if we really wanted to benefit the climate, we would convert these applications to future uses of green hydrogen made from electrolysis, because remember, the current use of gray hydrogen accounts for 2.3% of all CO2 emissions today, causing global warming. But that's really not what industry is talking about. They want to expand the uses of fossil hydrogen, meaning to sell more natural gas, into all of these other applications where they make less and less sense. So aviation, coastal vehicles, commercial heating, all of this stuff. And that is the game that they're playing. So after that introduction, I want to focus on a very particular example here in New Mexico that is a project that is underway right now. And it is to convert an old 40-year-old coal-fired power plant in the middle of New Mexico, just outside the town of Pruitt, not far from Grants. And it is called the Escalante Coal-fired Power Plant. It was closed in 2020 after about 40 years of operation. It used to be a 253 megawatt coal-fired generating station, sort of medium-sized. It used to employ 107 people there, but they've been laid off largely because the plant closed in 2020. A company called EH2 Power, which stands for Escalante Hydrogen Power, was formed in order to convert this old coal-fired power plant to both produce hydrogen and then to burn it for electricity. And we're going to talk about that. So this is what that power plant looks like from space. You've got the power plant here. Here's the big pile of coal and some cooling ponds, et cetera. And their plan was to spend what last year they said was $425 million. Now it's up to $600 million on the process of converting that power plant to produce hydrogen from natural gas, and then to take that hydrogen to generate electricity in the plant, and to bring it up and running by 2025. Last July, they told me it would create 110 jobs. More recently, they said, no, it's really actually more like 60 jobs. But to do that, and the process of converting it and doing all that work, they have to do a bunch of things first. They have to build what's called an air separation unit, which is a way to cryogenically freeze atmospheric air into its components of argon, oxygen, and nitrogen, because they need to use that oxygen in the power plant, in the steam methane reformer. They have to build that steam methane reformer, that big industrial facility, to take the natural gas and convert it to hydrogen. And then they got all that carbon dioxide comes off. The question is, what do they do with that? So then they have to build a carbon dioxide sequestration unit, which I don't have a picture of, but that is a third part of what they need to build new on this facility to do what they're planning to do. To run all of these three things takes a bunch of electricity. So any electricity that they generate at that former coal-fired power plant, which will be converted to burn hydrogen instead, will cut the actual amount of electricity that they could send to the grid, because they got to power these other things internally first. That's called parasitic loads. So instead of the 253 megawatts, their estimate was somewhere on the order of 164 megawatts, with some plus or minus around that, which makes the plant unprofitable, because all the expense to generate that electricity, to run all these air separation units, et cetera, with just that amount of electricity to sell, it's not going to turn a profit. So what do they plan to do to try to make a profit? Well, they're planning to try to sell the hydrogen that they produce there from the steam methane reformer, possibly to inject something like 5% of it into a natural gas pipeline, which comes with its own problems, to make something called green cement as well. So this is just explanation of the flow chart that they put on their website, showing, the air separation unit, the steam methane reformer. This is from their website, by the way. Hydrogen purification, generate power, all of that stuff. These black lines I put running off of the output of electricity, just to show you that they've got to have a parasitic load to run the air separation unit, the methane reformer, and the carbon sequestration unit. So that's the plan of Escalante Hydrogen Power. I'm going to skip this slide, a little too detailed. Remember I talked about them planning to possibly blend some of that hydrogen into a natural gas pipeline that is actually already nearby. And why would they do that? So there's a company called Lazard Investments and Banking that does the gold standard of analyzing the cost of generating electricity from various sources, various kinds of renewable energy, conventional energy, from natural gas, nuclear, coal, gas combined cycle. And they have these, the costs from high to low for each one of these things. In their last publication, they added this little blue triangle here to say, if you're planning to blend hydrogen into a natural gas stream and then use it to generate electricity, what does that do to the cost of that electricity? Well, it basically increases it by 49%. So instead of generating electricity in a gas-fired power plant at something like, was it $64 a megawatt hour, it's actually $89 a megawatt hour. Actually, it's 60. So it increases it by 49% to do the blending that they're talking about. So also not competitive, clearly nowhere near the very low costs of solar and wind that you generate today. Who funded Escalante Hydrogen Power? Well, according to their press release on their website from a company called Tallgrass Energy, they funded it, and they put on their website, press release, Tallgrass Energy acquires 75% membership interest in Escalante Hydrogen Power. So who is Tallgrass Energy? Well, they are an owner and operator of about 8,300 miles of natural gas pipeline plus some 850 miles of crude pipeline. And so they are in the business of shipping and then selling natural gas mostly. And that's what they, Escalante hydrogen facility is planned to do, is to take this natural gas. So they're looking presumably to create another customer for their product. The other thing it looks like very likely that EH2 Power will do is to mine the federal tax code for something called the 45Q tax credits, which is a federal tax credit created to provide a benefit to people who do carbon sequestration. And they get to write off about $50 per ton of carbon dioxide sequestered within this part of the federal tax code. So they will, that's their plan for producing hydrogen and for making it profitable, funded by natural gas. There is another company in New Mexico looking at producing hydrogen from methane or natural gas, and it's called Biotech. Biotech is a spinoff of Sandia Labs, and they make these things called modular hydrogen hubs. They look like this, about the size of a big house. And according to their website, they produce gray hydrogen from natural gas with what they call a more efficient modular version of steam methane reforming. And it emits lots and lots of carbon dioxide. In fact, it emits 9,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide for every 1,000 kilograms of hydrogen produced. So a 9-to-1 ratio of CO2 climate pollution for every bit of hydrogen they produce, 9-to-1. And they also produce NOx emissions in addition to the CO2. NOx is an additional air pollutant that needs to be regulated. It's a precursor to smog. So this is another proposal for what to do in New Mexico with hydrogen hubs. I think the proposal from Biotech would be to make these units and possibly place them next to the interstate highways and produce hydrogen for fueling hydrogen powered cars or trucks along the interstate. But they would be producing lots and lots of carbon dioxide as a price for doing that. Remember, we said that the European Union was really where this Hydrogen Council and the hydrogen effort started. Well, Germany, earlier this year in January, took a look at blue hydrogen and basically issued this directive to the government of Germany and said they will make no subsidies available for so-called blue hydrogen because of the issues that we're going to cover today, largely that it is not a solution for reducing climate emissions, which they're quite serious about in the European Union. So let's look at the science. There have been at least 2 very good peer-reviewed scientific papers published about what is the carbon footprint of producing blue hydrogen. And the first one was published in August of last year by 2 PhD scientists called Robert Howarth and Mark Jacobson. They're from Cornell and Stanford universities. And their paper is called How Green is Blue Hydrogen? The takeaway from the paper is kind of what I put in this red box. Says this: to call it a zero emissions fuel is totally wrong, said Dr. Robert Howarth of Cornell. What we found is that it's not even a low emissions fuel. They found that the greenhouse gas footprint of blue hydrogen was more than 20% greater than just burning natural gas or coal for heat. And in their paper, and I added this in the box up on the right, they use some pretty generous baseline assumptions, which will be important as we go further into the slide deck. They assume the upstream methane emissions is about 3.5% of production. They assumed carbon capture. So when we talk about carbon capture and sequestration, they assumed 85% of all of that CO2 was captured and stored during steam methane reforming. They also assume something that really nobody is doing, which is a 65% capture of the flue gases from whatever gas power plant that's creating the electricity to run the steam methane reformer, which is mostly the way that would be done. They also modeled the upstream methane emissions down all the way to 1.45%. Their baseline assumption to come up with this 20% greater number was 3.5% upstream methane emissions. But they looked at a corner case all the way down to 1.45, which is very, very low, significantly lower than anybody believes is possible or has plans to accomplish. So that was the first paper. It was reviewed in the New York Times, which I'll show you next. But I also want to show you this pie chart that I generated from the data in their paper just to make a visual about the carbon footprint that we're talking about. So 63% of all of those emissions, the climate emissions that they're talking about, really come from upstream fugitive emissions. And that's at that 3.5% methane leak rate. Another 23% of it come from the emissions from powering that steam methane reformer. And then you've got various other pieces from, incomplete capture of the steam methane reformer, et cetera, et cetera. So the lion's share overwhelmingly of the impact of this is because you're emitting a lot of methane upstream, because we are not at all doing a good job of controlling methane emissions from fracking and all of the pipelines that get it from there to end user. And it leaks, and it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. This is the New York Times article, which I will skip. This is the second paper that was published, warning of hydrogen climate impacts. This was actually published out of Australia in the journal Applied Energy, November of 2021, by Fiona Beck, scientist from Australian National University, came up with similar conclusions that making hydrogen from fossil fuels produces substantial greenhouse gas emissions that are the driver for global warming. So scientific paper number 2, fully peer-reviewed science. And this is a report looking more at the economic aspects of this from I think a company called Fitch Solutions, which looks at investments. And their conclusion was related to it, but very critical. We expect several technological barriers to scaling, and the cost for blue hydrogen will prove prohibitively expensive without carbon prices. It provides the risk of locking in the infrastructure and assets that will be our carbon intensive process that would presumably be stranded assets. And it is not possible to capture all of the emissions from creating hydrogen in this way. So paper number 3. This is a slide that talks to the effort that's going on underway, a very good effort by the New Mexico state government and the Energy, Mineral, Natural Resources, and Oil Conservation divisions to basically put some controls on the emission of methane in the production of natural gas, which a lot of it's done in the San Juan Basin and the Permian Basin in New Mexico. And they are looking at trying to really reduce the amount of methane emissions that are happening, much of it in an uncontrolled way through venting in the fracking fields, and to reduce it down to about 98% capture. So they're only hoping to emit 2%. But that's 2% from the fracking fields. But then there's all of the pipelines that go to the end users, from which about another 0.8% is lost, and the state of New Mexico is not doing anything about those. The bottom line is that even with the new methane waste rules and clamping down on fracking field emissions, it's not going to get anywhere near low enough in terms of upstream methane emission leaks to meet the requirements of making this a quote unquote clean hydrogen fuel, because upstream methane emissions, despite their best efforts, will continue to be a significant problem for the climate. And after that, earlier this year came this quite frankly shocking report that was a scientific study published in March of this year a very extensive actual survey using airborne equipment, looking at 26,000 active wells over 35,000 square kilometers. And they concluded that we're actually emitting methane to the tune of 194 metric tons per hour in the Permian Basin, which is not 2%, it's not 3.5%, it's actually 9.4% of all gross methane gas production in the Permian Basin is leaking into the atmosphere today, according to this scientific paper published this year. So the actual situation is dramatically worse than what was modeled in those papers. So that makes burning Permian natural gas something like maybe 3 times worse for the climate than just running a coal plant because of this uncontrolled fugitive methane emissions. Now, this is part of the problem that the state of New Mexico and their new methane rules are trying to fix, but it's going on right now and they got a lot of work to do, and we are nowhere near hiring and retaining enough people in those agencies to police this amount of pollution. So what is methane doing to the atmosphere? It is driving about 25% of all global warming, according to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, according to their reports. The reason why is that methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas with a global warming potential over a 20-year time frame that is 84 times worse than just carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas. So a little bit of methane leakage multiplied times 84 gives you, the impact of that much versus carbon dioxide. It is a terrible source of greenhouse gas emissions and accounts, as we said, for 25% of all global warming, and it is going up. Since 1985, we used to see atmospheric concentrations of 1,600 or so parts per billion. Since 1985 all the way over to March 2022, we saw this dramatic increase from the 1,600 range up to the 1,900 range. And it is tied to the timing of the 2008 US shale gas boom, which was documented in this article published in National Geographic. And so you just look at when the shale gas boom happened, and this plateau, which I'm not sure we completely understand why it flattened, but it went back up again dramatically as we really began fracking. So fracking is causing significant increases in methane releases. Anything that we do to use more natural gas means we extract more of this, which will mean more methane leaks, which will mean more impacts on global warming because of this. So if you remember, there were 4 hydrogen hub bills that were proposed in the state legislature to subsidize the production of hydrogen from fossil fuels, from natural gas, methane. They were actually all defeated because of a tremendous turnout by activists showing up in hearings and calling legislators saying, don't do this. This presentation that you're seeing today was actually presented to 26 of our legislators to give them the background to understand why this was a bad idea. So thank you all activists for helping to do that. Since then, the state government announced that they were going to join a potential consortium of 4 different states, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, plus New Mexico, in a multi-state hydrogen hub initiative. And that is going on now. And I believe that will be discussed in the meeting coming up in the Legislative Finance Committee next week. As an alternative, it's worth considering what we could do with that same kind of money instead, if what we wanted to do was to produce clean electricity and maybe some jobs for New Mexico. Remember, we said originally they were talking about $450 million to convert the Escalante coal plant and to generate maybe 164 megawatts of electricity out of that? Well, I just did some calculations to say, what would it cost to build a 100% solar energy plant with 4 hours of battery storage backup, which they call nearly firm power? And if you run the numbers, then it would cost maybe $328 million to do all of that. It would be very profitable, clean electricity, for $97 million less than their original estimate, which would leave you $97 million that you could invest in, some job creation in the town of Pruitt. Highly confident that we could figure out a way to employ 110 people in Pruitt with $97 million. In fact, you could just pay them 110 people $88,000 a year for 10 years with that kind of money without doing anything. So there are much better alternatives than to do what they're proposing. And this is where my math is. Let's look at the proposal for how they would use hydrogen. So one of their main applications is for transportation. For example, using hydrogen in a fuel cell vehicle or fuel cell trucks. They will have to compete against the current very large and growing infrastructure for electric vehicles and soon to be electric trucks, and the nationwide charging network that exists today for recharging electric vehicles. There are over 46,000 electric vehicle stations as of this last February, nationwide, public charging stations. Compare that to the hydrogen fueling network nationwide, which literally exists only in California. Only in California. There are 48 total hydrogen fueling stations in the state of California. There are none in the rest of the nation. Any proposal to use hydrogen as a fuel for nationwide trucking or cars has to build first a nationwide fueling network for hydrogen, which does not exist, and to compete with the already growing and low-cost charging network for electric vehicles. There is such a thing as hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. There are 3 main ones from Toyota, Honda, and I think Hyundai. The main seller is the Toyota Mirai. That's what it looks like. It is, it was those 3 vehicles together sold a total of 3,341 vehicles in all of 2021, compared to US electric vehicles, which totaled about 180 times more at 600,000 electric vehicles. So the fuel cell vehicle market is not taking off despite a lot of subsidies being applied by Toyota specifically to do that. And there are much better ways to solve most of the hard to decarbonize sectors that the hydrogen proponents talk about. This slide is maybe a little bit more in depth than I want to cover today, but you can review it later. One of the things that the hydrogen proponents talk about is that, industry needs to be decarbonized, and it could be responsible for, 23% of direct emissions. There are lots better answers for a lot of the things that they're talking about. And most of the hard to decarbonize sectors, which are really steel, cement, plastics, and chemicals, have better alternatives. Some of them, we still will need green hydrogen, especially for steel. But that is not the top priority. What we should be doing instead as job one, because it's half of carbon emissions worldwide come from pretty much generating electricity and running our transportation sector, burning gasoline and diesel in our fuels. We do that by rapidly building out clean renewable energy production in the form of wind and solar, and then use that to electrify everything like electric vehicles. That is job one for the climate. That's where we should be focusing. Hydrogen is a dangerous distraction from doing that. And that is kind of the end of my talk. This is the summary slide, just a repeat of where we started. blue hydrogen is a fossil fuel program, and the carbon produced from making blue hydrogen is at least 20% worse than just burning natural gas directly. We now know that in the Permian Basin, it's much, much worse than even that because of how much uncontrolled release and venting there is of hydrogen. So I am going to, I think, pause here and maybe stop sharing and open it up for questions and answers. So if anybody has a question, there are, along the bottom, should be a raise your hand application somewhere. Or you can just wave at me on the screen and or put a question in the chat and I'll go ahead and make an attempt to answer. So anybody have a question?
There's some questions in the chat.
Oh, okay, let me go look. Do that. So in addition to sustainable energy or sustainable economy development, question about how is carbon sequestered if it's mixed back with natural gas sent through a pipeline, presumably the end user. How does this qualify for a fourth? So that's actually quite a few different questions. Let me try to handle them one by one. So how is carbon sequestered? I don't pretend to be an expert, but I think the intent is after you pull it off of the, steam methane reformer, it's at relatively high concentrations. They put it into a pipeline. They have a carbon dioxide pipeline that sends it into some place where there's a hole that's drilled down into the earth, into some underground formation. And I believe that mostly they're looking at rock formations that can take carbon dioxide or that carbon and then combine it with some mineral underground that forms a permanent compound. So calcium carbonate would be an example of that. If they could find a formation that's got maybe some calcium from maybe old seashells or something, and pump it down underground, it can form calcium carbonate as a permanent kind of storage. That is just one example. I don't know all the geology of all the ways that they could do that, but that's one example of how to do carbon sequestration. So they have to find those locations, and then you're going to have to build carbon dioxide pipelines over land to ship it there, and at great expense, et cetera, et cetera. And then someone presumably would need to monitor those sequestration locations and answer the question, how are we going to make sure it doesn't leak back? Because it's a poisonous gas, and if it goes back into the atmosphere, you're not sequestering it at all, and you can't count it as reducing the carbon footprint. So question number one. How does this qualify for a 45Q tax credit? I believe they would do something like just measure the amount of carbon dioxide captured and pumped underground and then report it to the federal government and say, I sequestered 100 tons or whatever the number is, and then they get credit in some IRS tax form way. And that's all I know about that. Okay, another question. Let's see, Maya Van Rossum. Maya, are you here? Yes, there you are.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you for your kind words. Are we willing to do this for the National Voices Coalition? I have done this presentation many times, would be glad to do it again. If you'd like me to invite me, go ahead and contact me. Do you have my email, Maya?
Yes, I do.
Okay, yeah, just send me a note. We can work some out.
Yeah. And also Law 360 had an article about hydrogen, and sort of sounds like they're a moderating voice, but ultimately I think they end up trying to claim blue hydrogen is clean, but in a kind of tricky way. And I'm trying to find somebody to do a response to it. I think that just watching you tonight is fortuitous. I think you would be superb if you were willing.
Yeah,
you can think about it.
I don't know if I have the bandwidth to write a response, but certainly there are many published rebuttals, and you could send them a link to to Howarth and Jacobson's "How Green is Blue Hydrogen" article, or the New York Times story on it, and say, rebut this first, and then we can talk.
Good thought. Thanks, Tom.
Sure. Let's see, Jean, you had another question. Permian study of escaping methane doesn't seem logical that methane escape. Yes. So that is a longstanding question. If they could sell this stuff, why wouldn't they? Why would they just waste it? And I guess it just has to do with it's just complicated, and a lot of the production of natural gas is actually a byproduct of the production of oil, which is really what they're after. And to some oil producers, the natural gas is kind of a nuisance, because really what they want to do is sell oil at $115 a barrel. And in order to capture and do something beneficial with the natural gas, you got to build a natural gas pipeline to your oil rig. And so they have to wait for all of that to be done. And it's just part of the complications. And I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that, but those are a couple of answers that come to mind. It certainly is a waste of resources that are owned by the people of New Mexico, because those are our resources as citizens of the state. And any methane that they flare or vent into the atmosphere, they don't pay a royalty on. So there is no financial penalty to them for that waste and that pollution. The sequestration question related to tall gas. Did I answer that question, that part of your question, Jean?
Can I just say that was one confusing element that I found in your slides. I thought I heard that what tall grass was going to do was to capture the hydrogen, send it through pipelines to other places, and that they would get this 45Q tax credit because it would be considered carbon sequestration. So I just got confused. So if there's anything that maybe no one else did, but if there's a way to
I
clarify
apologize for that
Yeah.
confusion. Those are two different things.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
The 45Q tax credit is for every ton of carbon dioxide sequestered. That is different from shipping or selling the hydrogen that's produced. Those are different products.
Okay, thanks.
And I just put the link to the slides in the chat.
Thanks.
Okay. Bob Wesley asked, could you say a few words about how the process works to strip hydrogen from methane molecules? I'll say a very few words. Not an expert, but there is, that's one of the slides that I actually skipped. So if you, Bob, if you go in my slide deck and look at page 13, you'll see a little bit more detail on this. Maybe I'll just share it so I can cover it with something for you to look at. So where does the hydrogen come from? The process of steam methane reforming takes methane, CH4, plus pure oxygen in a chemical reaction that looks like this under the conditions of extremely high pressure and temperature. So they use high pressure steam, very high temperature steam to run this reaction. Methane plus oxygen creates water plus carbon monoxide. And then there is something called the water gas shift reaction, which takes the carbon monoxide plus more water, which is the steam, and then it converts it to carbon dioxide plus hydrogen. That is the chemical reaction that happens in a steam methane reformer. All right, and that's probably as much as I want to say about that. Anna, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to recognize we have a a young organizer on the call, Jessica Kitzel,
Hi, Jessica.
and she's from To Najone Anu, and
Jessica,
is from Black Mesa.
Great. Jessica, if you want to unmute and wave at me or say a few words, feel free. Okay, Jessica has in fact invited me previously to make this presentation to a couple of Navajo chapters, and I've done that in the last few months, and willing to do it.
Excellent. Excellent.
Sure, you're welcome.
Excellent.
Willing to do it
Thank
again if they need to. Yeah. Okay, and Crystal said bye. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask?
Is there any organized details regarding June 15th legislative finance meeting that folks might want to join in on?
Sure. I'm going to stop the recording now so we can have that discussion.